Good morning and welcome to the latest installment of the National Security Space Association's SpaceTime interview series. We deeply appreciate your time and interest. Today we focus on President Biden's budget request for fiscal year 2022 for military space personnel, programs, and operations. As our viewers know, the budget request was released very late this year. Congressional committees are holding hearings and committee staff are poring over budget justification documents to determine what's in the budget request and what's not, as well as identifying key trends and other important indications of the national security space priorities of the new administration. To help us understand the President's FY22 budget request for military space, we're honored to have with us today Congressman Jim Cooper, Democrat from Tennessee, who chairs the Strategic Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. Chairman Cooper will join us shortly after noon today following votes on the House floor. Prior to Chairman Cooper's comments, we're thrilled to welcome two renowned experts, Todd Harrison from the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Mike Tierney from Velos LLC to help analyze the FY22 budget request for military space programs. Todd and Mike, thank you both for joining us today and for your insightful analyses on this important topic. A little about their distinguished backgrounds. Todd Harrison is the director of the Defense Budget Analysis Defense Budget Analysis and director of the Aerospace Security Project at CSIS. As a senior fellow in the International Security Program, he leads the center's efforts to provide in-depth, nonpartisan research and analysis of defense spending, space security, and air power issues. He's authored numerous publications on trends in the defense budget, military space systems, threats to space systems, defense acquisitions, and military force structure, among other topics. Mike Tierney is a consultant with Velos LLC. A trusted advisor to senior executives in industry, government, and media, Mike provides timely and objective analysis of U.S. military investments in space capabilities and performs rigorous analysis for both public and private sector organizations on legislative, regulatory, budget, and acquisition policies affecting the federal market. His analysis has been featured in Space News, Aviation Week, the Denver Post, Breaking Defense, and many other media outlets covering the space industry. A quick word about our format. As noted, we will begin today's discussion with presentations by Mike and Todd. First Todd, then Mike. We will then open it up for questions from our viewers. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to pose questions. I will endeavor to get through as many of your questions as possible. We will then turn to Chairman Cooper around noon or shortly thereafter, Eastern Daylight Time. Before turning the floor over to Todd, I wish to state how much NSSA values the opportunity to again partner with CSIS on this annual MilSpace Budget Forum. NSSA is honored to work with CSIS and other organizations, whether think tanks, private groups, and other trade associations on topics of mutual interest. So thanks very much to you, Todd, and to your outstanding team. CSIS is a fantastic partner. Without further ado, Todd Harrison, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks, Chris. It's glad to be doing this again, and it feels like old times, except doing it virtually, doing back-to-back budget presentations with Mike. So yeah, it's great to be back and glad to be partnering with NSSA. And from our perspective, NSSA does such great work in helping raise the awareness and understanding of important space issues, military and intel space issues for folks in industry, in the departments, and on the Hill. So it's really great that we're having this forum and this discussion today. Of course, I can't go anywhere without slides, right? And so I'm going to put up some slides of my own here. And so hopefully people can start to see those. And the thing I would want to highlight first is, I'm going to be talking about kind of the macro budget picture here. And then Mike is going to go into more detail on what's in the space and the Space Force budget in this request. I think, some of the things going on in the macro picture here are really interesting and, help provide perspective to what's in the overall FY22 request and what we might expect for the future. So as Chris pointed out, this was a very late budget request this year. And that has a number of ramifications, in terms of when we're actually going to see the NDAA get passed and enacted into law and when we're going to see appropriations enacted into law. I've gone back and looked at the record on this. So, first of all, if people think that that this delay was going to cause a CR, well, you do have to look back at history, and in the past 50 years or so, DoD has started the fiscal year on a continuing resolution about 80% of the time. So we were likely to start on a continuing resolution regardless of when the budget was submitted. But it is fair to point out that it's probably, increased the chances of it being a long CR. Looking back at when budget requests were submitted more than a week late, and of course this one was several months late, the average CR in those years has been just under 4 months. When the budget request was submitted on time or within a week of its due date, then the average length of the CR was about a month. So we should be expecting, based on historical trends, that we're looking at a longer CR this year. That didn't surprise many people. So I'm not expecting that we're going to see appropriations enacted till December, January. And of course, as always, that depends on a lot of things that don't necessarily have anything to do with defense. Things like how do they resolve the debt ceiling that's coming up, and what are they going to do in terms of the increases requested in this budget for non-defense spending versus defense spending, right? And so Congress has got to negotiate a lot of other things at the leadership level before they can really get down to the details of defense appropriations and the NDAA, the authorization bill. With that kind of perspective, let me jump in here. And one of the things that jumped out to me in this budget request, which is not a surprise, is that it's continuing a lot of the trends that we've been seeing for a long time. And I like to put this chart up and show it to people. I often call it my getting less for more chart. The columns that you see here, the blue and red columns, that is the DoD budget adjusted for inflation over time. So you can see the ups and downs here in the budget. And the red part of the bar of those columns, that's the part that was appropriated as OCO funding. So one of the things they did in this budget request is they essentially got rid of OCO, moved it all into the base budget, and then increased the base budget to absorb it. So if people thought that they were going to get rid of OCO and zero out all the funding that was in OCO, they may have been disappointed by this, but people who follow the budget closely know that that's not what anyone was actually talking about doing. Now, how are they able to move all this money into the base budget when for years they've been fighting to keep more money in OCO rather than less, both DoD and the Hill? That's because the budget caps have ended. And the budget caps from the BCA, the Budget Control Act, they only applied to the base budget. And so anything you put in OCO effectively became a loophole to get around the budget caps. Well, now that we don't have the caps in place for FY22 and beyond, there's no need for the loophole. So the money just rolled back into the base budget. Eliminating OCO doesn't save you money on its own, and it really doesn't change a lot in terms of how the money can be spent because, you look in the details of the request and, they're spending a lot of that money in the same ways as they were before. There are some minor savings from the projected withdrawal from Afghanistan, but funding for Afghanistan does not fall to zero, nowhere close to it. We're probably saving $5 billion or so just by not having boots on the ground in Afghanistan. But a lot of the other funding that was going to support the Afghan government, going to support and train Afghan troops, that is going to continue. And of course, a lot of the intel collection that we're doing in Afghanistan may arguably get more expensive and more difficult to do if we're not able to stage those activities from bases close in within Afghanistan. We have to do that from out of the country and travel a longer distance in and out to get there. So, don't get too distracted by the fact that the OCO funding has gone away. It just rolled into the base budget. But the bigger trend here that concerns me, and we're not seeing a shift in, is the fact that the budget is at a relatively high level by historical standards, looking at inflation-adjusted dollars, higher than the peak of the Reagan buildup back in the 1980s. Yet the size of the force is near the smallest it's been since the end of World War II. And that is not a trend that is sustainable over time, right? Because, what we've seen in the past is when the budget goes up, for the past few decades, the size of the force stays relatively steady. And when the budget comes down, we actually have to draw the force down a little bit lower. And that's what happened under the Budget Control Act, is we got a little smaller when the budget came down. And so this is an ongoing trend, that the cost of our people is growing faster than inflation. The cost of operation and maintenance on a per person or per unit of force structure basis is also growing faster than inflation. So to maintain the same size force we have today, you've got to see real growth of 2.5%, 3% each year in your mil-pers and your O&M accounts. That's just to maintain the same size force we have today. If you want to modernize, then you're going to need to see additional growth in procurement and research and development, right? And so, that is a big problem when you are dealing with a flat budget, either flat with inflation or flat in nominal terms. And so the department is going to be forced, if they're going to keep to those top lines, those relatively flat top lines, they're going to be forced to make trade-offs. If they're serious about pursuing modernization, then they're going to have to make sacrifices in the size of the force. They're going to have to cut in strength. They're going to have to get rid of some units of the force structure, and they're going to have to try to keep those costs under control. But we're not seeing that yet, not in this budget request. And it shouldn't be a surprise, because this is the first budget request of a new administration. It's not likely that they're going to make big moves like that without having gone through the process of doing their strategy review, which is just really beginning now and should start to inform the FY23 budget as it's being developed over the next few months. So a big takeaway here is we have to wait and see. It's not clear how they're going to resolve this tension between force size and modernization. Now, if you dig into the budget a little bit more, I always like to look at the share of the budget by department and by the major titles of the budget. So this shows the share of the budget by department, and I'll point out here, Navy is Department of the Navy, so it includes the Navy and the Marine Corps, and Air Force is Department of the Air Force, so that includes the Air Force and the Space Force within that. And so just looking over the last 3 years, FY20 in the blue bar, 21 in the red, and 22 in the green bars, you can see some ongoing trends here. The Army has been losing budget share. Part of that is because of operations subsiding a bit in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, but part of that is because the Army is just losing budget share. The Navy has gained a little budget share. Of course, the Air Force, Department of the Air Force, has also been gaining budget share. Defense-wide has been coming down just a bit. Now, one of the expectations before this budget was released is that we were going to see more budget shift from the Army to the Navy. And that is a lot of the chatter that we had heard about ahead of time. Part of that was driven by the Trump administration coming out with a 30-year shipbuilding plan back in December that showed what it was planning for the Navy for FY22 and beyond in terms of shipbuilding. And had that plan gone into the budget, that would have required a significant increase in the Navy share of the budget, which presumably, looking at the strategy and the priorities, if you had to take it from somewhere, it probably would have come from the Army. But they didn't actually put that in the budget request. So I think some naval advocates were a bit disappointed that they didn't see more growth in Navy funding. And I think some ground power advocates were breathing a sigh of relief that they didn't get cut worse than they were already. But the real winner in this, in terms of the different services, was the Air Force and the Space Force. They got the biggest budget increase. They had a real increase, when you adjust for inflation. And you look within that, and Mike is going to go into this in more detail, but a lot of that increase, especially in the Air Force, is in research and development. So they are really putting money into investing in those new programs and technologies that we need to modernize for the future. Let me go on the next slide here. If you look at the budget by title, so looking at the major titles within the budget request, you see a little different trend line here. And, RDT&E overall research and development funding did go up. That is different than what was projected in last year's budget request. What we had projected for FY22 is that R&D funding would actually go down this year. But they reversed that and making changes to this request. and they actually increased RDT&E. And again, that is in alignment with what they've been saying about the focus on modernization. But it seems to have come at the expense of procurement. Procurement went down significantly from where it was last year. Now, keep in mind that last year's level of procurement funding was inflated a bit because Congress added more procurement at the end. And, this year is a little less than expected, but Congress is likely to step in and restore some of that procurement funding, because some of the things that are cut out of the procurement part of this request, things like, only buying one destroyer instead of two, those are things that DoD knows good and well Congress is likely to put back. So by cutting those procurements, they're basically punting to Congress and saying, hey, we know you're going to put this funding back, but you figure out how to pay for it. Either you find offsetting cuts elsewhere and then you take the heat for cutting those things, or give us some additional top line to pay for these priorities, right? And so that is now on Congress to do that. Now, in terms of O&M and MILPERS, we see O&M coming up a bit as a share of the budget, MILPERS as well, a bit higher than expected in terms of MILPERS. And that's telling us a number of things. So first of all, they do propose significant divestments of aircraft and ships in this budget request. But if you look at how much they're projecting they're going to save, they're not actually completely divesting these elements of force structure. They're retiring the platforms in the budget, but they're not getting rid of all the people associated with them in terms of the operators and the maintainers. And so that's why we don't see significant reductions on the personnel side of things. And down the road, that could come back to bite them, because the more people you keep on the payroll, the more mouths you've got to feed in the future, the more it's going to constrain your ability to focus more resources on modernization down the road. So they have not made those hard choices yet. And let's be honest, a lot of the divestments that they're proposing in this budget, the Hill's not going to have it. Congress is likely to force them to keep many of these systems they're trying to retire. And again, that just punts it to Congress. So Congress wants to restore these items instead of allowing them to be retired, then Congress has to figure out how to pay for it, right? And so at the end of the day, my takeaway from this budget request is they didn't make a lot of the hard decisions yet. I think a lot is still pending on the strategy review that's just kicking off. And I think in a number of areas, they punted to Congress. And I expect that at the end of the day, it may be many months from now, maybe 6 or 7 months from now. But once we get defense appropriations, I think it's likely that Congress is going to raise the top line. Instead of DoD getting 715 as was requested, I think they're likely to get something closer to 725 or 730 in the end. So I think Congress will probably end up adding $10–15 billion, and some confidence margin around that in my estimate, because a lot depends on how they end up negotiating past the debt ceiling deadline, and what kind of deal they strike on the overall budget when it comes to non-defense spending. So I think there's still a lot that we don't know yet about this administration's priorities and plans for the future. Just because they didn't give us a 5-year plan with this budget, and a lot is still pending on this strategy review that's just now kicking off. So, I think we're going to have to hold our breath and wait, see what Congress does with this budget, but more importantly, see what DoD does in its FY23 request once they've had a chance to build their own budget, this administration to build its own budget from the bottom up. Then we'll have a better indication of what their real plans and priorities are for the future. So with that, I'll hand it straight over to Mike, and so he can go into more detail about what we're seeing in the space portion of this budget request.
Perfect.
Thank you, Todd. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Todd. And thank you, Lexi, for pulling up the slides there. Just want to echo Todd's sentiment at the beginning here that it's good to be back. It's a year since we've done this. Last year's event was canceled due to COVID. We've got a very late budget request this year, so we're even later this year. But it's good to be back with Todd talking about the things that we love most, which is nerdy budget data. So I'll get into basically the total DoD space budget, which is largely, the Space Force budget requests, but also highlight areas where outside of the Space Force, there are investments try and draw out some of the key themes, some of the big news items. But I do want to just start by saying I think I would echo Todd's sentiment on the broader DoD budget relative to the space component thereof, which is that it's a lot of continuing the trend. And in the space market that we're in the midst of a very significant transition with the standing up of the Space Force. And so a lot of what we're going to see here in the budget is a continuation of that transition from establishing a new service, transitioning other services programs in, and the Space Force's commitment to try and get that done right through certain initiatives. So with that, the first big takeaway is that it is continuing to sustain the growth of the United States Space Force, which is not an insignificant point in my perspective. I think if you rewind back to January, there was still some chatter that whether or not the Space Force would survive the new administration, whether there would be a National Space Council. And I think, this budget obviously continues that growth and sustaining of the Space Force, which is, at one point was, being questioned. So it kind of, in part with that, this budget does reflect the drive to unify DoD space activities underneath the Space Force. And so this next bullet, we do see some transfer that we were expecting or through some of the past fiscal years of Army and Navy programs formally into the Space Force budget. The Army is primarily on the SATCOM satellite operations side, and on the Navy side, it's the narrowband SATCOM communications program. Two kind of initiatives that kind of aligned with the broader legislative objective to get space activities unified under a single command. On the kind of operational programmatic side, a lot of the investments in this year's budget focus on BMC2, so Battle Management, Command and Control, and then the protect and defend layer of our space capabilities. Those are really the kind of programmatics that you'll see and the emphasis thereof in terms of funding. There is also aggressive development of PLEO solutions. That is still being primarily driven by the SDA, which is technically not, as of this budget, part of the Space Force, still outside of the Space Force. But the Army also has some tactical space PLEO activities that, despite the bullet 2 ahead about transfers to the Space Force from the Army, that is an initiative of tactical space, tactical ISR for the warfighter that is continuing in this budget request. A large portion of what you'll see on the next slide relative to some of the increases in the year-to-year budget request for the Space Force and the space budget overall is being driven by classified investments. 2 years ago, with the standing up of the Space Force, we got a new budget structure, and now we have a very clear, in the sense that it's in the spreadsheet of a line called Space Force Classified Programs. We don't get any detail, obviously, on that, but it provides a big bogey, a big total roll-up of all the classified RDT&E inside of the Space Force. And that shows an almost $1 billion year-over-year increase. And two senior Space Force and Air Force officials have basically confirmed that a lot of that is on the new classified program side. 800 million of the classified funding is in new classified programs. So a lot of what we're seeing, is going to be obfuscated into the classified budget in terms of some of those new investments. But I think you'll see some of the corollaries in the open budget as well. And then this last point, I think is even getting more attention in recent past 24 hours. Chairman Smith, I think, was intimating at this during yesterday's House Armed Services Committee. The department has put forth 2 initiatives to establish new organizations, one called the Space Warfighting Analysis Center. It's not really a new organization, but to further increase the capacity thereof, but also to create a National Space Intelligence Center co-located at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to focus on the space ISR mission. And I think you saw a little bit yesterday, and so that's funded in this budget, the efforts to make those things happen. And yesterday during the House Armed Services Committee, you heard the sentiment that Congress intended to create Space Force without growing government, without growing and creating new organizations. And so there was already a little bit of skepticism about the need for some of these new organizations. That's it from a broad perspective. Next slide, Lexi. And then here we have, this is total DoD, inclusive of Space Force and other DoD space investments. The 20.2 number is basically a Velos number. There is a DoD number out there. I think it's a little bit higher, 20.6. I think they do not provide an itemized incremental where that is in terms of outside of the Space Force, but we've done a pretty good job of identifying what those space programs are. It's things like SDA, it's things like DARPA space programs and technology, things that I'll get into in a little more detail at the specific level later, but this is the broad strokes, right? You get the real sense of how much money the Space Force has consumed of the space budget, and that we are continuing to transition those, and that this pattern of growth and transitioning from other services is likely to continue. For one, this orange row here on defense-wide, the 1.5 billion, a lot of that is SDA. And in the next budget request, that will move right back into Space Force, and you'll see a big bump in the next request, likely reflecting that SDA increase. And so this really does, kind of hammer home. You see the Navy decrement there on the bottom row that reflects the transfer of MUOS over into the Space Force, and there's really not a ton left over that's exclusively, predominantly space in the Navy budget. So that's it kind of from a broad perspective. You'll see that there's kind of growth at the DoD top line, 17.9 to 20.2, and at the individual kind of major component level at the USSF level from 15 to 17. I think, Todd, you've done some good analysis, and I think others have pointed out a lot of this 2 billion increase is reflective of transfers and of this classified increase. And then when you really get into the programmatics, as we will, there's not a ton of new investment and new money in that. It's a lot of transfers and the classified. Next slide, please. This is effectively the same for fiscal year 22, but just to really give you the visual of what we're talking about here in terms of how much of this 20 billion is dominated by the Space Force. And again, next year when we have this event and we brief it, the blue slice will get even larger in all likelihood. Next slide, please. So what are those, I've talked about this a little bit, but what are those investments outside of Space Force that continue to persist despite some of these transfers in of other service programs? Again, it's the Space Development Agency largely. It's almost $1 billion. I think they got they've now got an RDT&E line, a set of RDT&E lines, a procurement line, an O&M line. And that is all, per the defense guidance, going to move into the Space Force. But that is, developing that proliferated LEO transport and tracking layer, the associated ground, the associated launch, and all the support that goes with that. That is a large portion of that, delta between the 17.4 for Space Force and the 20.2 total DoD. It also includes funding that resides in the MDA space programs. This is a bit of a congressional priority. Congress has consistently directed the department to fund the hypersonic ballistic tracking system payload through MDA, have them develop and manage that payload, and do that in concert with Space Force and SDA from an architecture and integration standpoint. So, this budget actually does reflect a request now of 256 million inside of MDA's account with very explicit articulation of that connection and collaboration with Space Force and SDA. So that should take one issue off of the table for Congress. DARPA is also still, out there pursuing advanced technology investments in the space domain. Those are not, have not, and probably likely will not roll into Space Force at any time in the future. Those are funding things like RSGS, which is the remote servicing of geosynchronous satellites, the DARPA Blackjack program, which is a proliferated LEO program, and then some launch infrastructure programs as well. Army, as I said as well, they are carving out an argument and a sustained argument for a tactical space layer that allows them to shorten sensor to shooter and have a dedicated, proliferated LEO small sat, CubeSat component of the overall DoD architecture. And so they continue to invest in, it's not large dollars, but in my mind, the fact that these continue to persist despite some of these transfers in shows that this is an area where the Army feels that they want to carve out a small portion of their budget to continue to invest in tactical space and ISR. That said, as I mentioned earlier, the SATCOM operations funding is going to move no later than October 1st, 2022 to Space Force. Next slide, please. So now we're getting into that 17.4, and how does that break out within the Space Force between the different appropriation types, kind of like Todd did on the DoD macro. And you're seeing, it's predominantly an RDT&E initiative, but that O&M bin is growing and continues to grow. And I think you'll see that, the RDT&E, while we're seeing that 800 million increase, the reality is that that blue row of RDT&E includes the wedge for the U.S. Space Force classified programs that got a very large increase. So again, a lot of the RDT&E the increase is derived from those classified investments, not necessarily major new investments reflecting some sort of paradigm shift at the individual mission and program level. So this gives you a pretty decent breakout. The next slide, please, Lexi, gives you it in the same pie graph visual form, just to show you how, predominant the budget is dominated by RDT&E investments. Next slide, please. We did also want to, from the Space Force and Air Force budget briefs, provide an update on where we stand in terms of personnel with the Space Force. Again, all things considered, this is a service that did not exist 3 years ago. And we have whole cloth, developed this. And to the departments and services credit, they've been very driven to not have any perturbations at the mission level while they, stand up this organization, which is a large bureaucratic feat. A lot of that is people, a lot of that is paying for people. And you see here in the budget request, the continued growth of the Space Force personnel cadre. There's been a lot of commitment and talk about, developing that cadre of guardians for the Space Force. And you see it on both the growth on both the civilian and on the active duty side as well. Next slide, please. So one of the takeaways that we got was that a lot of the initiatives that were new or priorities for the Space Force were in this kind of management bin and kind of O&M bin. So we saw a lot of funding growth in the Space Force O&M accounts, 30%. From 21 to 22, they created 2 more new O&M lines, operations and maintenance line. The one that I highlight, facilities, sustainment, restoration, and modernization, I just highlighted because, 3 years ago, the Space Force didn't have facilities to sustain, restore, or modernize. And the creation of that budget line is just one more baby step, to the service being just like any other service with the same type of O&M sustainment requirements as the other services. We did see, there's an SMC acquisition workforce line in the budget. It's in the RDT&E section, and that had a 20% growth over the projected level from last year's request. Last year's request did include a FIDEP, unlike this year's. And so we are able to kind of look back and say, what were they planning for 22 last year? And on the acquisition workforce side, we're seeing growth year-over-year projection. These 2 new centers, the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, discrete investments inside of the budget. There's 6 million kind of referred to in an O&M line for the SWAC, but there's a discrete RDT&E line, I think it's called Space System Support, that is really kind of to fund the Space Warfighting Analysis Center. And the space, again, to reiterate what the Space Warfighting Analysis Center is intended to do from General Raymond's kind of perspective, not quote him or anything, but it's a future-looking, architecture-driven analysis center. How do we develop and architect a force that is responsive to the future threat? That is the kind of focus of that center. Whereas this next one, the National Space Intelligence Center, $20 million in O&M, called out in a lot of their highlights, is again focused on the Space Force carving out its role in the ISR mission, right? So this is, I think, peeling effectively the space component out of the National Air and Space Intelligence Center and dedicating coordination with the lead USSF ISR point of contact to ensure that space ISR, which is predominantly provided by the Air Force now through airborne platforms, can evolve to be provided by space, and that there's a role for Space Force in that. Again, I think just the knee-jerk reaction from members of Congress, and maybe we'll hear from Congressman Chairman Cooper later today about what their reaction is to this from an organizational management standpoint, a bureaucratic growth standpoint. There's going to need to be some, I think, justification and convincing that these things are absolutely needed in light of other organizations. We also have, the National Space Defense Center, and again, to distinguish that from these two, the National Space Defense Center, more oriented on coordination between the DoD and the intelligence community on space programs. So next slide, please. So we've tried to kind of summarize the 17.4, break it out into a mission-based look. To be very clear, these mission rows that you see on the left are Velos kind of proprietary. They're our analysis. They're not binned this way by the department. So it's not an exact science. I say this every year. We have to kind of pick and choose which bin to put it in. But for the most part, this is pretty clean. And you'll see if you just do a quick comparison between the 21 to 22 across the board, it's at least as much as last year, if not greater. You see in that first row, the classified row, that's a $900 million increase. We've heard from two senior DoD officials that said 800 million of that 4.6 is new classified programs. And so that's accounting for a large portion of that $2 billion year-over-year increase. Todd, I think you've pointed out as well, a lot of it comes from the transfers as well in terms of the year-over-year increase. But you do see at least a steady hold, if not an incremental year-over-year increase at the mission level. So what are the major highlights? 2.5 billion of the 2.7 in missile warning is for the next gen OPIR program. That is by far the largest single program in the space budget. Initial launch capability by fiscal year 25 for the GEO component of that. I think the polar component is by 28. Congress has been holding the feet to the flame, holding the department's feet to the flame on this program for a number of years, encouraging them, really demanding that they invest in the budget to reflect what's needed for next gen OPIR, rather than relying on things like reprogramming actions or congressional plus-ups. And so we do see a year-over-year, increase for next gen OPIR greater than was projected in the last budget request for fiscal year 22 to kind of, I think, meet some of those congressional expectations. On the launch side, which is, another huge component of the budget overall, it funds 5 NSSL launches. That's up on the procurement side. I think the Tierney launch services agreement side is actually a little bit lower in terms of investment, but still a major component of this overall 17.4. You see the next row, PNT, where the budget procures 2 GPS-3 space vehicles as well. There's also an investment in the user equipment side. That's an increase year over year from the projection for the user equipment side. So that's actually 2 years running now where they've continued to invest in that initiative more and more. The transfer from UOS from SATCOM, that's narrowband SATCOM from the Navy, is obviously one of the big highlights in this budget. There's big investments into the Enterprise Ground Services program, which is kind of the next generation of unified ground for the department from a SATOP standpoint, and a lot of the BMC2 investments. There's a lot of bins, this next bullet, that are just large bins of kind of S&T money with 6 focus areas relative to space technologies, propulsion, space vehicles. That amounts to about 300-400 million in 3 or 4 different program elements for a variety of mission or space technology applications. Solar panel arrays, things like that are reflected in this S&T line, the dark orange. Space domain awareness is something that is continuing to be prioritized. The Deep Space Advanced Radar concept, DARC, got another year-over-year projected increase compared to what they expected to request. It sustains the weather system follow-on and EOIR, which has long been a congressional bugaboo about getting those programs and those gaps filled, kind of consistent with those expectations. And then again, on the management side, funding these new organizations. Next slide, please. These are the focus areas as articulated by the Space Force itself. I think it tracks, largely to what we just went through relative to, missile warning and missile tracking being one of the largest, if not the largest, kind of mission-based application. The protect and defend priority, I think you're seeing a lot of that in the classified increase reflected. PNT with the purchase of the 2 GPS satellites, 5 launches in assured access to space. One note is that there was a congressional requirement for them on the small launch, the tactically responsive space launch operations, there was a congressional mandate to fund that across the FYDP and fund it in this fiscal year budget request. On that responsive launch, small launch side, the department did not include that in its request, and that will be likely an area of continued congressional attention. And then you see the rest. I mean, one thing that we're hearing a lot about is the transition to a digital service. I mean, I did some keyword searching, and it's not really necessarily reflected at the programmatic budget justification level. You're not seeing a shift. You're not seeing, even rhetorical shift about that embedded into the budget justifications yet. So that's it really from a broad perspective. We have a lot more detail, I think, at each one of these mission levels that we can follow up on. But with that, I'll turn it back to Chris and the team for questions.
Well, thank you very much to Todd and Mike. Fantastic presentations. As always, you guys are on top of the numbers like nobody else, and really appreciate the presentations. So let me launch into a few questions. I've got questions for both of you. Todd, I wanted to ask you, the Biden administration did not submit a future years defense program, out years funding levels together with the FY22 request. Question from the audience is why didn't they do that? What's the impact of not submitting an out year budget, the FYDP? And has this been done previously? Have other administrations not submitted FYDP together with the single year budget request?
Yeah, it was expected. It was widely expected we weren't going to get a 5-year budget plan. And it actually is fairly normal for the first budget of a new administration, simply because they haven't had time to thoroughly review the budget, and particularly those out-year projections. And they don't want to submit something and then be held to that the following year as the baseline for comparison. The Trump administration, when they came in, their first budget request, they said they weren't submitting a FYDP, but then we got the budget justification documents, and lo and behold, numbers were in there. But they kind of disavowed them and said, yeah, well, don't pay attention because we didn't review those. All right, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. But nevertheless, for budget analysts, it gave us something to compare against the following year, whether they liked it or not. But if you go back to the first budget of the Obama administration, the FY10 budget request, they also did not submit a FYDP, and the numbers really weren't there. So this is to be expected, and it's not out of the ordinary, and we have seen it before.
Thank you. Another question has to do with investments in commercial space capabilities. Todd or Mike, what were you able to divine in terms of new significant investments in leveraging commercial space capabilities? There's obviously been a very significant rhetorical emphasis on the part of the Space Force and others across the department on leveraging commercial space. Are we seeing a real implementation of that broader rhetorical support, or is it modest at best at this point? How would you characterize that?
Yeah, I'll take this one, Todd, first. At least, in a general sense, you're not seeing necessarily a wholesale embracing across, missions and platforms. Excuse me. One area where we did see a very discrete, embracing of commercial in a way that they haven't previously is in the SATCOM domain. This fiscal year 22 budget request includes a new line from a budget request standpoint called ComSatCom integration that has long been, over a few cycles, added by Congress, and it's now made its way into the budget. So that does reflect, some degree of priority. The tactically responsive space launch operations concept derives a lot of its capability off of commercial launch services. You didn't see that in the budget as well. And so, it's definitely an area for continued growth. Again, I'd go back to my initial statement. I think we're still in that transition period. I think the department is still trying to equip itself with the right people, tools, and capabilities to develop that force structure for the future. And hopefully we'll see that kind of continue to grow in the future.
And Chris, if I can jump in on that one as well, I think that there's a lot of opportunity here for the Space Force and for DoD overall, and the intel community, quite frankly, to do a better job of having a long-term vision, a long-term strategy for how they can effectively leverage a lot of the innovative capabilities, as well as the sheer capacity that's being built out in many of these commercial space systems. And it's not just commercial communications, although we see a lot of exciting things going on there with companies, like SpaceX launching Starlink and OneWeb starting to deploy its constellation, and, Amazon moving forward on their Kuiper constellation, right? A lot of interesting things going on there, but also on the commercial space-based remote sensing side of things. Exciting developments there in terms of companies building out their electro-optical observing capabilities, building out synthetic aperture radar constellations, even things like RF monitoring from space. And, there are many cases in where, we need to be thinking about how do we integrate these different sensors, these different communication pathways into our battle networks, right? We talk about JADC2, and a lot of that can and should be coming or going through space. And so I think commercial is an important part of how we can build that out and add more resilience and redundancy to our capabilities, but they need a deliberate strategy for how they're going to do this going forward.
Absolutely. And Todd, you mentioned that Congress may add $10 to $20 billion to the top line of the defense budget later in the year. If that's the case, where do you believe they're likely to place those additional resources? Where in the DoD budget?
Yeah, I mean, in Congress, a lot of support for shipbuilding and a lot of support for what DoD might like to call legacy weapons. So I think we're going to see a lot of funding go back into those areas of the budget. There could be some increases in space-related funding. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing more from Representative Cooper when we go to him about what their priorities are in terms of potentially adding more funding for space. But I expect that a lot of those additions are going to be outside the space area.
Right. Well, speaking of Congressman Cooper, sir, we see you there in your office. Thank you very much for joining us. Todd and Mike, we greatly appreciate your efforts. If you wish to remain on the line, we would love to have you listen in, and we may have some additional questions for you as well. But given that we have Chairman Cooper with us now, if it's okay, we'll go ahead and transfer to him. Congressman Cooper, thank you again for taking the time. We greatly appreciate it. Let me do a brief introduction of you, sir, and then we'll get right into the substance of the presentation. It's my great pleasure to introduce Congressman Jim Cooper. Congressman Cooper has represented the 5th District of Tennessee since 2003. What some of you may not know is that he previously represented Tennessee's 4th District from 1983 to 1995. He's Dean of Tennessee's Congressional Delegation. He was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, and he received a law degree from Harvard Law School, among many other accomplishments. Congressman Cooper chairs the Strategic Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee and is well known as a serious student of military affairs and for his bipartisan support to shaping policy on weighty national security issues. This, of course, extends to his deep and abiding interest in national security space matters, the topic of today's discussion. He partnered in a bipartisan fashion with Congressman Mike Rogers of Alabama and many others in promoting major reforms of the organization and management of the nation's military space forces and programs, which led to the reestablishment of the U.S. Space Command and establishment in law of the U.S. Space Force as a new military service within the Department of the Air Force, among many other actions. Chairman Jim Cooper, welcome. On behalf of the National Security Space Association, we thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to be with us today. And we welcome any opening comments you might have, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for that kind introduction. I didn't mean to rush your format, but we just finished voting here.
Yes, sir.
And all of Congress is headed to the airport pretty soon. So you can
Well, we
get
appreciate
over
your
in that
time.
rush. But
Yes,
I'm
sir.
grateful for you for convening this meeting. It's extremely important that we focus more American attention on national security space. I'm grateful for your efforts and the efforts of CSIS. We literally can't do enough in this area because so many people who are interested in space are not necessarily interested in it for the right reasons. This isn't science fiction. This isn't speculation anymore. It's essential to everyday living. And I like the phrase infrastructure of infrastructure. And as we contemplate an infrastructure bill in Congress, this is almost more fundamental than anything else we could be doing. And the national security aspect is particularly important. So I'm delighted to try to be of use to you. I also want to make myself available to the attendees of the conference because I learn something from every conference I attend. There's so many people with wisdom, some of whom served in uniform before, some of whom are just outside experts. But we really need to collect all the talents of America and the Western world to figure this out in the right way. It's very exciting, the birth of a new military department. The birthing process is not pain-free. It's difficult. Space Force is still very young. But as you correctly pointed out, we'd had a space command before and we were silly enough to get rid of it. So hopefully America won't repeat that mistake. But I'm awaiting your questions and hope to be of use.
Well, thank you. We greatly appreciate your time, sir. We've been discussing the President's budget request for FY22 for defense and in particular national security space programs. What's your initial assessment of the adequacy of the President's budget request overall? Are there particular areas where you believe it could or should be improved at this point, whether in general or in particular with respect to national security space programs?
Well, let's review the bidding first and then understand the typical Washington reaction. I think the Space Force recommended budget is about $17 billion, which is up about $2 billion, which is close to 10%. And that would almost make it the envy of the rest of the military. Now you can quibble, is the glass half empty, half full? But that's pretty darn good for starters. Now, in terms of adequacy, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And of course, Washington is full of organized appetites, and it's never enough. So what I'm thinking is what matters is how well the money is spent. And it's known for decades that the United States is the largest military budgets on the planet, and we haven't necessarily gotten our money's worth. So with this new command, this new force, let's make sure we get our money's worth. I've cited for a long time the NRO as an example of an agency that has gotten more bang for the buck than perhaps some others have.
That makes sense. Thank you. There are reports that the Air Force may face cuts of over $33 billion and the Navy around $40 billion over the FIDIP that's being worked on inside the department. And rumor has it that the Army will face even more severe cuts. How might such cuts impact national security space readiness and modernization activities? I know those numbers are speculative at this point, and obviously the department hasn't settled on a FIDIP, set of FIDIP numbers. But what's your general take on the overall budget trends for the department and the impact that those numbers will have on national security space programs?
We need to be alert not only to foreign threats, but also domestic budget threats. And, there's really no constraint on our defense budget as long as we're willing to pay for stuff. Just this automatic assumption that, oh yeah, we'll put it on the tab. And by the way, the Chinese have been one of our largest external funders of our debt. So I hope that the national security community will be focused on, if they want more, let's be willing to pay for more. I think that, as y'all have pointed out in the conference so far, there is no FIDIP yet. So let's not tell ghost stories. They may or may not be true. I want us to be alert, but I see this annual panic as people think, oh, we're going to be screwed. If not now, then later. It's like, give me a break. Anticipatory appetite can be as damaging as current appetite.
I understand. Mike Tierney, one of our previous interviewees here, who's still on with us along with Todd Harrison from CSIS, noted that the apparent increase to military space related funding is primarily a result of anticipated transfers into the Space Force from other services, along with normal programmatic increases such when programs move from development to procurement, for example. Is there, in other words, seems to be not a lot in the budget that's new content, if you will. Is that your impression? Have you had a chance to dive into the numbers sufficiently to either agree or disagree with that conclusion?
Well, I think that charge is largely accurate. And remember, just a couple of years ago, the Air Force was maintaining that we not only didn't need a Space Force, that they were doing a great job of keeping space ready with even though it was only their third or fourth or fifth priority. So we got to hold people accountable. There are many ways we're not holding the military accountable. The last witness we had said that there are 25% surplus facilities on Air Force installations. What is Congress doing about that? We're not very good at rooting out waste and inefficiency. So let's be better in all aspects. I want to be alert. I want to make sure the Space Force is properly funded, but let's also be smart about this, because the US still outspends the next 10 nations in a row on military defense. And are we 10 times better? Well, we're better, but I don't think we're 10 times better. So let's focus again on bang for the buck.
Yes, sir. One hears a lot about the desire to keep spending lean for the Space Force and the Space Command. Yet there's a fine line between lean and insufficient. There's significant concern that the Space Force and Space Command are under-resourced in terms of personnel and funding. In your view, is the budget request for FY22 for the Space Force and the Space Command adequate at this point, or have you had a chance to really dig into it to determine, back to what you said before, whether there are inefficiencies that could be, where funds could be transferred to higher priority targets, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a fierce advocate for the Space Force, but I don't want to be greedy. And, what is adequate? What is enough? What matters are systems that are defensible and survivable and resilient. Mm-hmm. And we need to see a lot more of those. As you know, so much of the innovation is not even taking place in our military. It's taking place in private sector companies, and I'm sure we'll discuss those. So we should be thankful that the overall US effort is extraordinary. And I'm not used to praising eccentric billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson. You got the list. It's kind of cute that their hobby also helps America.
Absolutely. Both the Space Force and Space Command have submitted unfunded priority lists for consideration by you and your colleagues. Can you share your thoughts on these lists? Have you had a chance to review them, and how likely is it that some of the items on those lists will be funded as part of the National Defense Authorization Act or the DoD Appropriations Act?
Mm-hmm. I have looked at those lists, and they're another annual Washington ritual. I wish Santa Claus had brought me this, and I didn't get the red flyer truck I really needed. I think your listeners should know that the Space Command unfunded priorities list is only about $60 million, which in Washington terms is chicken feed. General Raymond's Space Force list is more robust at $800 million, but this is all very doable. And again, we can do far more than that, particularly if different constituencies have any reasonable way of paying for it. But with the regular infrastructure bill, that's what's held us up for years. People want it, but they don't want to pay for anything. Mm-hmm. So, and we don't have to pay for everything, but we've got to be more alert to not having the Chinese fund our defense budget.
Right. The Space Force has made significant progress in standing up the first new service since 1947. Likewise, U.S. Space Command has moved out with alacrity as a geographic command with responsibility for the space area of operations. Yet much hard work remains. In your view, what steps are needed to complete the effective build out of both the Space Force and the Space Command? How far along on the journey would you say they are at this point?
Well, this is the most difficult part of the birthing process, when you finally cut the umbilical cord and you raise the small child on its own. And of course, we need the Space Force to be an adult already. We can't really wait. And everybody has brilliant ideas for the separation from, mom. It's hard, and we're going to get some things wrong. But I think overall, General Raymond has done a brilliant job. This is not easy. Even coming up with the name Guardian was fraught with difficulty. It's amazing what people, especially the armchair generals, love to criticize. So I think overall a good job has been done. We really have to make sure that acquisition works. Mm-hmm. But fortunately, we have a model there with NRO, and I hope we use that model more frequently.
And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Congress legislated two important new positions within the department: an Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy and an Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition and Integration. Do you have any indication as to when the President might nominate individuals for these critical positions? And What do you see as the most pressing agenda items for those who will fill those positions?
Well, as to who the president would nominate, that's above my pay grade. I'm confident he'll nominate somebody good. There's been a dispute, as you know, within the Pentagon about whether the October 2022 date is really the date we need to focus on or whether it's sooner. I'd like it to be sooner, but this is one of those umbilical cord questions. We can figure this out because remember, we're all on the same team here. And sometimes the fiercest rivalries are within the departments or between the departments in the Pentagon. So let's not let the politics of the puzzle palace dominate here. We can and must figure this out and do it so that we have better, stronger satellites in the air.
Absolutely. Congress also provided the department with a golden opportunity to redesign the space acquisition process from the ground up, rather than merely tinkering on the margins or adding new layers of bureaucracy. The initial report to Congress on this topic was submitted, but then withdrawn due to internal disagreements, as you know. Is the Congress willing to wait and see what's in that new report, or will you and your colleagues legislate needed reforms to the space system acquisition process prior to submission of that report? And can you give us some examples of what you would like to see in the report? And what do you see as the biggest obstacles to a more effective and efficient space system acquisition process? And oh, by the way, we only have 5 hours to let you answer that. So,
Well, it's curious. You know, I view Congress as a board of directors. We should not be micromanagers. You have to pick good people, and then you have to let them. You know, in the days when the defense budget was almost half of national spending, the defense bill was only about 120 pages long. Now it's thousands of pages, and we think of ourselves as experts on all topics. So I'm a delegator, and I think it's particularly unfair to the Space Force to ask them to be bold in satellite architecture and technology in so many different ways. And then when they come up with an acquisition plan that's at all bold, we're shocked, because, and I'm willing to consider most anything. I just want it to work. Practicality works. You know, in my region of Tennessee, we're very conservative, but our power company is actually a socialist enterprise. It's called Tennessee Valley Authority. And it's there because private power companies didn't want to help us. And Franklin Roosevelt gave us something that works. And we still have some of the lowest power rates in America. So I'm for what works. And I think you'll find sensible Tennesseans of the same mind. We want what works.
that's great. And speaking of space system acquisition, there's a long and growing list of organizations that develop new national security space technologies. It's a veritable alphabet soup, as you well know. How do you and your colleagues in Congress ensure that funding on space systems is focused clearly on meeting the urgent needs of America's space warfighters, rather than R&D for R&D's sake, for example? Is there a clear understanding of the role of each of these space acquisition organizations, or is there a need for greater, clearer lanes in the road, if you will, between what different organizations, the roles of different organizations?
Well, before you give research for research's sake a bad name, I favor pure science. I actually helped start something in Washington called the Golden Goose Awards, the unintended benefits of government-funded research, because it's amazing what is discovered, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident. As we're learning from AI and quantum computing and areas like that, we really have to expand our outlook. And this includes, you know, not just geographically, because that's a limited term, but considering things like cislunar space and beyond lunar space. So if we're not at the scientific forefront of virtually everything, we're going to be behind. And other countries are putting in enormous resources and much more affordable resources than ours. So I'm proud of all those alphabet soup groups. Each one can contribute. You don't necessarily know where the discovery is going to come, but we are blessed to have so many folks thinking about this, including, I don't think NASA was on your list, or NRO. You know, it's amazing what people can come up with. And sometimes it's that little known satellite that discovers something visiting a planet I'd forgotten the name of since grade school that, you know, comes up with a universe shattering discovery. So it's remarkable what we can be found out. And this is why so many young people are excited about space. This is the pure frontier, maybe the last frontier, and it's the ultimate frontier. And we need to harness our wisdom to try to explore it in a sensible fashion.
Absolutely. Sir, you mentioned space system resilience, and resilience is an imperative in an era of increasing counter space threats. Yet there's no real agreed upon strategy for how to achieve resilience. For example, some argue for disaggregation, while others argue for rapid replenishment, and still others recommend additional measures to counter adversary attacks. Do you believe there's a one-size-fits-all solution to achieving resilience, or instead is a layered approach to space system resilience that blends the best of various architectural and system design approaches such as defense in depth and proliferation, the more appropriate approach? And this is using your law training, what you might call a leading question, leading the witness.
Well, I favor all of the above. Again, I want what works, and I want what's affordable and sensible. You know, I'm reminded of the space pen, which my late wife dearly loved, which cost apparently $25 million to develop because it could ride upside down in a gravity-free environment. And the Russians just used a pencil. You know, we got to do what works. As for the false dichotomy between disaggregation and resilience, let's do both. You know, one advantage of small sats or CubeSats is that they're both disaggregated and replenishable. So these multi-billion-dollar, exquisite, unique assets are magnificent, and there is and will always be a place for them. But it's harder to duplicate a multi-billion-dollar exquisite asset, and it's also harder to hoist it up into space. So we're getting way more practical about this. One of the companies that has intrigued me most recently is Relativity Space. You know, who knew that a 3D printer could do something 16 feet in diameter? It's just stunning what can be created. So we need to tap into that genius and use all our resources. And some of the best discoveries we don't even know about yet.
Agreed. Senior DoD officials, including the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Hyten, and the Chief of Space Operations, General Raymond, have criticized the overclassification of certain space systems and capabilities. Certainly, one needs to find an appropriate balance between protecting sensitive capabilities that can provide a war-winning edge on the one hand, and demonstrating such capabilities in peacetime to deter aggressive actions by our adversaries on the other. Do you share the belief that overclassification of space capabilities is a problem? And if so, how and what steps do you recommend for addressing this problem?
Let's divide the question. I think that to inform the American public so they're adequately supportive of space, they need to be more aware of the threats that are out there against our satellites. I like to mention GPS. That's one of the greatest gifts in the history of the world. It's a multi-trillion-dollar gift that we didn't even think of charging for. And why are our potential adversaries trying to senselessly duplicate that at great expense? And that just gives them an opportunity to perhaps take out our GPS satellites that have benefited them as much as us. So I think that we can figure out a good solution here. I would be optimistic that we can find ways to make all this work. General Hyten has found very frustrating within the Pentagon to get a low orbit disaggregated architecture approved. One of the main reasons Mike Rogers and I wanted to start the Space Force is there were 60 people in the Pentagon who could say no, and there was no one who could say yes. So oftentimes we met the enemy and it's us. We are our own worst enemies. So let's try to flatten the organization, streamline it, and have intelligent decision-making. And then I think we'll all be better off.
Thank you. To touch again on a topic that I know is near and dear to your heart, and you mentioned earlier, many national security space leaders talk about the need to better leverage commercial space investments and capabilities for national security purposes. Commercial data products and services can provide significant near-term benefits to military operations. What's your overall assessment about both the opportunities to leverage commercial space and the efforts underway within the department to do so thus far? Where are we in that journey in your estimation, sir?
I think the Air Force was already opening up with AFWorks to the private sector, and I think the Space Force has just vastly accelerated that trend. By far, the most exciting things happening in space are in the private sector, and it's extraordinary, the speed and the force with which they're moving. So that's an incredible benefit. We've got to make sure that the innovation helps America first and foremost. I don't want all that innovation going right to our enemies, our potential enemies. So we have to be very careful about the cyber threat, which is sometimes overlooked in all these discussions. And your earlier question about overclassification, we got to make sure that the U.S. R&D budget is the U.S. R&D budget, that we're not funding Chinese research. And so much of the time we've been doing that. So there are ways to make this work. I'd be optimistic. In fact, I'd be excited. One of General Raymond's fondest points is that so many of the top Air Force Academy graduates are choosing the Space Force now. You know, it's really the hottest thing going in the military, and that's very exciting, especially for a new and fledgling service.
There's a very significant increase in the budget, as was described by our previous speakers, in classified space capabilities. Increase of nearly $1 billion, $900 million, according to Mike Tierney's analysis. Can you, to what extent are you tracking those investments? What are the issues there associated with some of the capabilities, to the extent you can say, in an unclassified environment?
Well, it's all good news. I'm extremely fortunate because I've just recently joined the Intelligence Committee as well as being Strat Force Subcommittee Chairman. So now I'm fully privy to all the secrets, and it's good news. Our three-letter agencies have done an extraordinary job for many years, oftentimes without acknowledgement, and we should be supremely proud of their work, and it's continuing, and we should all be thankful for that because we all benefit whether we know it or not.
Right. I'd like to ask Todd Harrison if you have a question or two for Chairman Cooper, and Mike as well. If you'd go next. Todd, over to you.
Yeah, Representative Cooper, it's good to see you again virtually, and thank you for joining this event. You know, I wanted to see if you could expand a bit on your views about, you know, whether we need a Space Force Guard or Space Force Reserve component of some kind, and what that would actually do and how it could be beneficial or not for the service.
Well, Todd, as you well know, there are many people in the private sector who are our weekend warriors in the Guard or the Reserve, and they serve a very valuable function as a liaison with the private sector and with civilians. So they kind of bring the best of both. So, but what we have to be on the lookout for is not bureaucratic boxes, but talents. And particularly in some parts of the US, there are probably a world of folks who happen to work for private space companies. And why shouldn't they be involved, especially if they're Guard or Reserve? In other parts of the country, it's probably less likely you're going to find those talents. So we need to make sure that this is practical and it works. And the days of mindless bureaucracy should be over. The days of maximum US capabilities so that we can meet and beat any threat, that should be what we're focused on.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. This is Mike Tierney. Good to see you again, sir. I was a former HASC MLA. Look how far I've come. One thing I want to follow up on is some of the Chairman Smith's comments yesterday when during the hearing. I think we're relative to some of the new organizations that the Space Force has put forward, the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, the SWAC, and the NSSA, as well as the National Space Defense Center. Do you share, or do you have any skepticism or concerns over the need for those organizations? Do you understand where the department's coming from and the difference between those individual organizations? Be interested in your perspective on that.
Well, as I was saying earlier, I believe in delegation of authority, and I think General Raymond's done a great job so far. Let's give him some leeway. Let's not micromanage. It's not like the average member of the committee really knows better. You know, we can all weigh in and we can all look important on TV, but what matters is whether we have an effective capability. One issue that's seldom discussed is offloading the space traffic control to the Department of Commerce. That's long overdue. That would help our reputation in the world, and our credibility is unrivaled, but it needs to be put in a civilian agency and put there fast, because our greatest strength are our allies, and but even our adversaries or potential adversaries trust our warnings. And as space junk fills the heavens, we've got to help make space safe for everybody.
Thank you for that.
And sir, I have a few questions for you about intelligence, and we'll start with a broad question and then burrow in on some specifics. To what extent do you think our leaders, both in Congress and in the executive branch, are clearly imparting to the American people the nature of the threat that we face to our space systems, as well as our overwhelming reliability, or our overwhelming reliance on space systems for economic and military activities? And what can we do better in that regard?
Well, political leaders are important, and I think the folks in the Biden administration, they're true government professionals. There's no president in American history more experienced than Joe Biden. So they're doing all that government officials can. But remember, in our mixed economy, so often the most credible spokespeople are folks like Tom Hanks. He kind of alerted America to the COVID threat when he got it. That's when people started waking up. Athletes also have a huge soapbox. So when it comes to helping people understand, has any generation in history been more dependent on social media than this one? And how is social media transmitted? Without satellites, there's no internet. There's no Venmo, much less any ATMs. Our dependence is so complete. It's like electricity. We both are vital. And we know that, if your battery goes dead or electricity goes out, your IQ is cut in half, because most people can't answer any question unless they Google it first. I taught at Vanderbilt Business School for about 20 years, and the kids in the back of the class are Googling the answers. They don't have to have a memory anymore. They just have to have fast typing. And we've really got to up our capabilities. A Southern company, a big utility company in the South, has one day a year when they do without telephones. They do without anything electronic, because they've got to keep the electrical grid working. And sailors don't like to use sextants, but the Navy has gone back to that. So we need to make sure our residual skills are in shape, just in case there should be outages. And that helps people be alert to how overwhelmingly dependent we are.
The U.S. Space Force recently became the 18th member of the intelligence community. The Space Force Intelligence Agency activity and the U.S. Spacecom Joint Intelligence Operations Center have been established. Yet there's widespread agreement that the U.S. does not today possess a strong operational intelligence or OPINTEL capability. Do you agree with that assessment? And what can Congress do to help ensure that the Biden administration prioritizes space intelligence support and allocates the necessary resources for this important mission? We obviously have to understand when we're under attack and anticipate such attacks as best we can.
Well, aspects of our intel community need help and need support. And it's a problem in democracy because it's hard to talk publicly about these things without giving our enemies an advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding just space, actually, I think over the decades, we've done a pretty good job of, first with early warning systems, radars in Canada and stuff, so we'd have as much warning as possible. But there are terrible gaps, including with cruise missiles and things like that. Now, drones are a problem. As technologies develop, there will inevitably be efforts to have asymmetric threats against us. We coped for 20 years with the foreign terrorist threat, but I think you're seeing actually a concerted effort in space to be better, and I think you're going to see results from that. And I think General Raymond, General Dickinson are leading that effort right now, but they will eventually be replaced by newer, even maybe bolder leaders as space becomes its own publicly perceived domain. Hopefully it won't be for war fighting. Hopefully it'll just be a global commons, but our near peer adversaries have tried to make it into a war fighting domain, and we have to respond to that.
And also on space intelligence, discussions are underway regarding creation of a National Space Intelligence Center. What's the status of this effort, and how do you see this issue playing out in the coming months?
I actually haven't heard as much about that in particular. Remember, basically all the agencies they're working hand in glove today. You know, when you go visit CIA or NSA or any of the three-letter agencies, it's not like space is a stepchild anymore. It's absolutely essential for everything that they do. So explicit acknowledgement of that might help, but it's implicitly acknowledged every minute of every day.
Right, we have a question from the audience on the recent science and technology bill that passed the Senate. Would you like to comment on that bill? And in particular, are there elements of that that will impact the U.S. space capabilities?
Is that the bill that tried to reduce reliance on Chinese chips? And
yes, sir.
Okay. Well, in the old days, that would have been called industrial policy, and certain people would have been against it. But now that we realize our extraordinary dependence, just-in-time delivery of essential things from countries that may or may not have our best interest at heart, I'm glad that we're focusing on not a mindless and reflexive domestic content requirement, but we've got to always be self-reliant. And we've forgotten that in a lot of ways. Few things are more important than chips. So I welcome the Senate effort. I haven't read the bill, but I look forward to doing so. And I imagine there'll be an equivalent House effort. You know, rare earth metals are another area. And fortunately, we're boosting our domestic capability there because we let that slide. I am a believer in free trade, but when we let the Trans-Pacific Partnership fail under Trump, we lost a real opportunity there to harness our allies in a constructive fashion against the Chinese sphere of influence.
We have another question from the audience. The Space Development Agency budget was pretty much as expected based on the FY21 projections. What are your thoughts on how it will be received on Capitol Hill for FY22? And given the not insignificant increase in funding for Space Development Agency that's recommended in the FY22 request, what's your general take on that? And do you think your committee, others will be supportive of that?
Well, I really like SDA, and it's part of that, you know, alphabet soup you were mentioning of folks who are helping us be stronger in space. What really matters, though, is not budgets, but brilliance. Sometimes all it takes is a smart man or woman with a chalkboard to figure stuff out. Now, it may help to have a Cray computer behind you or some other nice toys, but what matters is insight and fresh thinking and bold thinking. And that can come from a lot of different directions. You know, in his early days, Elon Musk was dismissed as an eccentric, but having proven himself right in a number of areas, now he's one of the richest men in the world. It's amazing how genius sometimes is slow to be recognized, and then it's rewarded. So there are young scientists, there's some older scientists out there now whose ideas are worth thinking about and worth heralding. And we need to make sure that the Defense Department takes maximum advantage of those ideas.
We have a question from Teresa Hitchens. Teresa asks, the Space Force is lobbying to become owner, operator, and provider of tactical ISR from space, GMTI capabilities in particular, a mission that is now firmly in the hands of the National Reconnaissance Office. Do you think responsibility for that mission should go to the Space Force? And I'll add on to her question, is there room for the department to have its own capability there, and recognizing that the department focuses on tactical reconnaissance issues, whereas the NRO is more strategic in its approach?
Well, I think that, you know, remember, we're all on the same team here. You know, whether you're playing halfback or fullback, like, give me a break. All that really matters here is whether the warfighter is well served and whether the intel community is well served. And NRO has a proven track record in that regard. I think before you hand off the ball, let's make sure that there won't be a fumble. And the Space Force has a lot on its plate right now. So let's not rush these decisions. And if it's being capably handled today, let's probably stick with that for the time being, because beautiful bureaucratic charts are not our goal here. All that matters is effectiveness.
Right. Todd and Mike, would you guys care to ask a final question before we wrap up in a moment?
Not for me, just thank you, Representative Cooper, for joining us and giving us as much time as you did.
Great to see a successful former MLA, man.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
And Todd?
Yeah, and likewise, I just want to say thank you again for joining this forum, and we hope to see you around in more events like this throughout the rest of the budget season.
Now the Hill's finally opening. It's kind of amazing where it can actually see each other unmasked, not just on Zoom.
That's right. Well, sir, I'd like to conclude with a question about bipartisanship. You have been a champion of working closely with your colleagues across the aisle to find solutions to vexing national security problems. How difficult is it to sustain such an approach and philosophy in today's highly polarized political environment? Is bipartisanship on national security matters still possible? And do you anticipate that bipartisan support for reforming America's national security space enterprise will continue through this Congress?
Well, I'm thankful the Armed Services Committee is one of the last bastions of bipartisanship in Congress. We don't always succeed, but we try. It used to be that a few other niche areas like that, like agriculture, things like that. But in no area is bipartisanship more important. Y'all remember the phrase, politics should stop at the water's edge. We've got to be unified in our presentation to both allies and potential adversaries. We are Americans first, and we're proud of that. And we've got to focus on keeping our nation strong. And that's our first duty as legislators. So it is frustrating sometimes because you see people act out. I was just in a committee hearing a few minutes ago, and a normally calm, reasonable guy, when it came to a statement, suddenly sounded like a flame-throwing dragon. And there's really no need for that. In the gym, everybody's basically nice, where there, thank God, no cameras. Once you turn on the camera, people start misbehaving. So, and I'm an advocate for full disclosure and, journalism and cameras and everything, but we need to stop misbehaving and start focusing on what's good for America.
Well, sir, on behalf of the National Security Space Association, we greatly appreciate your time today and your service to our nation. And we look forward to continuing the dialogue with you in the coming months and as you guys go about marking up the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 22. Again, to Todd and Mike, we appreciate your presentations earlier, appreciate your partnerships. And sir, with that, if you have any closing remarks, happy to give you the floor for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your excellent interview, Chris. It's good to be with you and Todd and Mike. Look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Yes, sir. Thank you. All right. Thank you all for attending, and stay tuned. Our next interview will be next week with Rear Admiral Mike Bernanke, the J5 at U.S. Space Command. So thank you very much. Out here.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everyone.